The invitation was supposed to be a joke. That was the part Ambassador Velthari Us would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. That no one on the Galactic Conclave's outreach committee had actually meant it. That the name had been added to the official delegation list as an act of inter-office mockery. That Councillor Dra of the Ethian Collective had laughed so hard his secondary breathing slits had gone into spasm when he first proposed it. "Send the invitation to humanity," Dra had said, scrolling lazily through the list of uncontacted civilizations flagged as too primitive, too violent, or too unstable for first contact. "Send it to the Deathworlders. See what happens." The room had erupted. The Ethians, the Sarathi, the ancient, slow-blinking Sithali who rarely laughed at anything, even they had let out their low, resonant hum of amusement, because the idea was absurd. The Galactic Conclave's Grand Assembly was the most prestigious political body in 7 star systems. Its annual summit of civilizations was attended only by species that had achieved certain benchmarks, sustained faster-than-light travel, a unified planetary government, at least 200 years without large-scale self-inflicted extinction events. Humanity had achieved exactly none of those things. They were a Class 4 developing civilization flagged under 3 separate Conclave watchdog designations: volatile, uncontrollable, and most damningly, Origin World Hazard Class Omega. Their planet, a dense high-gravity hyper-oxygenated rock orbiting dangerously close to a volatile yellow star, produced organisms that, by any reasonable biological standard, should not have been able to survive past childhood. Humans ran on a cocktail of adrenaline, stubbornness, and a biochemical pain response that, perversely, seemed to motivate them rather than discourage them. They had also, as of their most recent conflict assessment, been in some form of active war for approximately 93% of their recorded history. Sending them an invitation to the summit of civilizations was like handing a flame to a creature made of dry paper and calling it diplomacy. It was a joke. Councillor Dra filed the invitation anyway, a formal gold-sealed encrypted diplomatic transmission sent through the Conclave's official channel to the coordinates of a small blue-green world on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. He expected no response, or perhaps, if he was lucky, a confused and barely coherent reply from whatever primitive governmental body the humans were currently operating. Something to read aloud at the next committee meeting for a second round of laughs. What he got instead made the laughter stop completely. The 412th Summit of Civilizations opened on the first day of the Conclave's ceremonial calendar, with all the grandeur that 400 years of tradition could produce. The Grand Chamber of Aurum was vast, a tiered amphitheater carved from a single asteroid, its walls inlaid with the sigils of every member civilization, its central floor a mosaic of star maps depicting the 7 systems under Conclave governance. It seated 300 delegates. On this occasion, all 300 seats were filled, and a significant number of their occupants had quietly rearranged their schedules when word had spread through diplomatic back channels that the human delegate would be present. Nobody wanted to miss this. The general consensus, as best as it could be summarized across 6 species and multiple translator variants, was that the human would either be quietly absurd and quickly forgotten, or would commit some spectacular diplomatic breach that would be discussed for generations. Either way, worth watching. Dr. Mara Voss took her seat in the gallery reserved for observer civilizations, a polite architectural signal that humanity was present, but not yet a member, acknowledged but not equal. The chair was built for a Sithali delegate, which meant it was roughly 3 times wider than she needed, and featured an integrated nutrient misting function that she ignored. She had brought on a small handheld device what appeared to be written notes. The summit opened with the traditional recitation of the Compact, a 90-minute ceremonial reading of the founding principles of the Conclave, delivered in all 6 official languages, by 6 senior counselors in rotating order. It was the kind of proceedings that tested the patience of even veteran diplomats. Mara Voss listened to all 90 minutes without looking at her notes, without looking at her device and, as the delegate from the Sarathi would later recount in extensive detail, without once appearing bored. She watched each speaker with the focused attention of someone learning something, which was deeply unsettling to everyone who had expected her to be lost. The first formal session of the summit was a debate on the outer expansion protocols, a long-running dispute between the Ythian Collective and the Sarathi Assembly over territorial rights in the unclaimed systems beyond the seventh star. It was a complex, decades-old argument involving 17 competing treaties, multiple resource claims, and a cultural grievance that dated back to a border incident most of the current delegates had not been alive for. Observer civilizations were not permitted to speak during formal sessions. This rule was, as far as anyone could recall, never broken. It lasted until the second hour of the outer expansion debate, when Councillor Dra-A, apparently still operating under the belief that the human's presence was more performance than threat, gestured toward the observer gallery with a magnanimous sweep of his tendrils and said, "Perhaps our new guest would like to share what a developing civilization thinks of territorial disputes? For educational purposes." The chamber tittered. Several delegates leaned forward. Voss looked up from her notes. "The Varith Clause," she said. Her voice carried without effort across the chamber's acoustics, calm, clear, and completely certain. Article 14. Subsection 9 of the Third Expansion Accord, ratified 211 years ago. The Sarathi position on the outer systems is technically valid under current treaty law, but it relies on a clause that was inserted during the negotiations by a Sarathi junior minister who has since been tried and convicted by his own government for treaty fraud. The Ythian Collective's legal team is aware of this. They've chosen not to raise it, because doing so would also invalidate the Pathera trade agreement, which benefits Ythia significantly. Both sides are negotiating in bad faith. They have been for 60 years. I can explain what a resolution might actually look like, if anyone is interested. The chamber was silent. Councillor Dra's tendrils had gone still. First Speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had been in this debate for 26 years, turned slowly in her crystalline seat and looked at the human delegate with an expression that, through the cultural translator, registered as, "I knew it. I knew this would happen." It was Grand Arbiter Mensol, the eldest of the Sithali, who had presided over 4 summits and was not given to drama, who finally spoke. "Ambassador Voss," said Mensol, in a voice like tectonic plates settling. "You are currently seated in the observer gallery." "I am," Voss agreed. "Observer civilizations do not have the floor." "I know. And yet you spoke." "Councillor Dra invited me to." She glanced across the chamber at Dra, who appeared to be attempting to become structurally invisible. "I was being polite." Mensol regarded her for a long moment. The Sithali's slow blinking eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, moved over Voss with the deliberate patience of a creature that measured time in centuries. "You have read the full treaty archive," Mensol said. It was not a question. "The accessible portions," Voss said. "There are approximately 2,000 documents in the restricted archive that your public diplomatic records reference but don't publish. I made some educated guesses about those." Educated guesses. Based on the patterns in the documents I could access, cross-referenced with the voting records of the relevant parties and the economic data from the disputed systems. I was probably wrong about some of them. What percentage do you estimate you were wrong about? Voss considered this with the straightforward thoughtfulness of someone doing a quick mental calculation. 17%, she said. Maybe 20. Which meant she was right about 80% of a classified archive she had never seen. The Grand Arbiter looked at her for another long moment. Then Mensol did something that none of the 300 delegates present had ever seen the Grand Arbiter do in 34 years of presiding over summits. She offered the floor. "Ambassador Voss of Earth," said Mensol, "the Grand Chamber will hear your proposal." What followed over the next 6 hours would later be referred to, in conclave historical records, as the Voss Sessions, a name that was accurate if profoundly understated, like calling a tidal wave the Voss Wave event because technically, that was what it was. Mara Voss did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not perform. She simply talked, in the measured, precise tone of someone who had spent a significant portion of her life studying exactly this problem and had run out of patience for the ways powerful institutions avoided solving it. She dismantled the outer expansion dispute in 40 minutes. walking both sides through the legal architecture of their own positions until the fraudulent clause was exposed in full view of every delegate, and then immediately offering a restructured framework that preserved core Wythian trade interests while genuinely addressing the Sarathi territorial concerns. It was not a perfect solution. She said so explicitly. It was a functional one, which was something 6 decades of summit negotiations had failed to produce. She then, without being asked, turned to the secondary agenda. The Drift Cluster humanitarian question, a slow-burning crisis involving the unaffiliated, non-member civilizations on the conclave's outer edges, species too small or too resource-poor to meet membership thresholds, effectively abandoned by the same body that claimed to represent all sentient life in the region. This was the item that never made it past the first hour of any summit session, because none of the member civilizations had any direct economic incentive to address it. Voss addressed it. "You have a word for this," she said, looking around the chamber. "In your diplomatic language, you call it peripheral consideration. We have a different word for it on Earth. We call it abandonment. And we've been doing it to each other since before we had language to name it. I'd like to think you might do better." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. First speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had spent 26 years opposing every proposal this chamber had ever made, who had been present at 11 summits and been moved by exactly none of them, looked at the human delegate with her slow, crystalline eyes and said quietly, "What do you propose?" The summit recessed at the end of the first day with more achieved than had been accomplished in the previous 4 sessions combined. This was not, in itself, the catastrophic backfire. The catastrophic backfire came on the morning of the second day, when Sub-Counselor Veen, who had by this point progressed through humiliation, anger, and a defensive form of professional jealousy, made the decision to launch what he privately called a re-establishment of context. What he publicly called it was a security briefing. "The chamber should be made aware," said Veen, standing at the central floor with the stiff posture of someone executing a plan he had told himself was reasonable, "that the civilization currently represented in our observer gallery carries several significant risk designations in our xenobiological registry." He activated the chamber's projection system. Earth's file appeared. Conclave surveillance data compiled over 40 years of covert observation, the wars, the weapons, the sheer catalog of violence that humanity had produced in its short, ferocious history. The nuclear tests, the chemical weapons stockpiles, the casualty figures from conflicts that had ended and the ones that hadn't, biological hazard assessments, atmospheric toxicity reports from weapons testing sites, a footnote on the human immune system that described it as effectively waging constant internal warfare against thousands of simultaneous microbial invasions. Veen presented it all with the careful framing of someone who thought they were revealing something damning. The chamber watched. And then something happened that Veen had not prepared for. Mara Voss watched too. She watched the entire presentation without expression. She did not protest or defend or attempt to minimize. She let Veen run through every piece of data, every conflict, every weapons system, every piece of evidence that humanity was exactly what the files said it was: volatile, violent, and relentlessly, exhaustingly dangerous. When Veen finished, the chamber turned to look at her. She stood up. "Everything in that file is accurate," she said. Veen blinked. "We have fought wars for territory, resources, ideology, religion, and spite," Voss continued. "We have developed weapons capable of ending all life on our planet, and we came disturbingly close to using them on more than one occasion. Our history is, by almost any measurable standard, a record of what happens when a highly intelligent, highly aggressive species is given tools before it's developed the wisdom to use them responsibly. I'm not going to argue with any of that." The chamber was very quiet. "What I will tell you," she said, "is what that file doesn't contain." She reached into her jacket and produced a small data chip, which she held up briefly before walking to the chamber's data interface and inserting it without asking permission. A new projection appeared. Not weapons, not casualty reports, not toxicity assessments. It was a graph. Multivariable, spanning 200 years with dozens of overlapping trend lines, and every single one of them across 2 centuries of data was moving in the same direction. Down. War fatalities as a percentage of global population, Voss said. Down 87% over 200 years. Child mortality, down 91%. Extreme poverty by any measurable standard, down from 40% of our global population to under 9. Life expectancy, up 40 years in 2 centuries. Literacy. Global literacy in 1820 was approximately 12%. As of this year, it is 96. We are still violent. We are still dangerous. We still have weapons we should not have, and conflicts we have not resolved. I am not standing here to tell you that humanity is good. I am standing here to tell you that humanity is improving. And we are improving faster than any species in this chamber's history improved at our developmental stage. Faster, in fact, than several of your current member civilizations were improving when they applied for conclave membership. She turned to look directly at the Sarathi delegation. The Sarathi were admitted to the conclave 312 years ago. At the time of their admission, they were 40 years removed from the crystalline purges, a series of internal conflicts that resulted in the destruction of approximately 30% of their civilian population. The conclave admitted them anyway, because the trajectory mattered more than the history. She turned to the Ethians. The Ethian collective achieved unified planetary government 61 years before their admission application. Earth achieved unified planetary government 9 years ago. We are moving faster, not because we are better, because we had the advantage of watching you, watching all of you, and understanding what was possible. She pulled the data chip from the interface. The projection disappeared. We have known about the conclave for 40 years. We have been watching your sessions, translating your broadcasts, building models of your political structures, and learning your languages, all 6 official ones, plus several unofficial ones that your own diplomats pretend not to speak in formal settings. We did not reach out because we were not ready. We are reaching out now because we are, and because you sent the invitation. She sat down. The chamber was silent for a very long time. It was First Speaker Tharis of the Sarathi who spoke first, the same delegate who had warned 3 days ago that this was going to go wrong, who had the most institutional authority to say, "I told you so," and choose instead to say something else. The Sarathi crystalline purges. Tharis said slowly. You knew the figures. Yes. That data is sealed in the conclave's restricted archive. I know. I told you I made educated guesses. I was probably right about more than 80%. Tharis made a sound that the cultural translator rendered, after a moment's processing delay, as a very dry laugh. Ambassador Voss, said Grand Arbiter Mensol from the presiding seat, I would like to ask you a direct question. Please. Why did you come? Not Earth. You. There are approximately 9 billion humans on your planet. The diplomatic corps chose you. Why? Voss considered this with the same direct honesty she had applied to everything else. Because I'm the best at this, she said. And because I have a low tolerance for rooms full of powerful people avoiding hard problems. And you believe the conclave is such a room? I believe every room with power in it has that tendency, including rooms on Earth, including rooms I've been in. The size of the room doesn't change the problem. It just changes the scale of what gets avoided. Mensol was quiet for a moment. The observer designation carries a standard review period of 50 years before membership consideration. I know. There is a provision in the original compact, Article 3, I believe you may already be aware, for an accelerated review in cases of extraordinary diplomatic contribution. Voss was still. Her expression didn't change. But something in the room seemed to shift, as though the air pressure had altered slightly. I'm aware of Article 3, she said. The Sarathi, said Tharis, would be willing to second a motion for accelerated review. As would the Sithali, said Cultural Liaison Sierri, who had not spoken since the docking bay, and appeared to have spent the intervening time deeply regretting the section of her paper that Voss had critiqued. Veen opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, said nothing. The accelerated review passed. It was not a unanimous vote. Nothing in the conclave ever was. There were 8 dissenting votes, all from smaller member civilizations who feared, not unreasonably, that admitting a species with 9 billion individuals, a Class Omega homeworld, and a demonstrated capacity for outreading a classified archive on first contact was going to change the Conclave's internal dynamics in ways they could not fully predict. They were right. It was going to change everything. The formal admission process took 18 months, a blink, by Conclave standards. During those 18 months, Mara Voss remained on Conclave Station Aurum as Earth's provisional representative, operating officially in an advisory capacity that everyone understood was not advisory in any meaningful sense. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not, as several member delegations had privately braced for, attempt to dismantle anything. She asked questions. She asked them constantly, relentlessly, with a focused precision that was initially mistaken for interrogation and eventually understood to be something more like architecture. She was building something in her head, layer by layer. And the questions were the material. The Sithali Grand Archivist, a creature who had been alive for 400 years and had spoken to perhaps 12 individuals in all that time, began voluntarily seeking out her company. The Sarathi first speaker took to including her in pre-session briefings as a matter of course. Even Velthari Us, the protocol ambassador who had felt so thoroughly assessed in the docking bay, found himself consulting her on matters that were technically outside her provisional brief. She was, in some way that none of them had language for yet, useful, not in the transactional way that conclave politics defined usefulness, but in the way a structural element is useful, quietly load-bearing, easy to underestimate until it's gone. Councillor Dra resigned from the Outreach Committee 6 weeks after the summit. He cited personal reasons. Sub-Councillor Veen did not resign. He remained in his seat for the full duration of the admission process, attending every session, saying very little, and carrying himself with the careful dignity of a person who has understood, fully and permanently, that he has made a significant error and intends to spend the remainder of his career not compounding it. It was, in the private assessment of several colleagues, the most graceful thing he had ever done. On the day of Earth's formal admission to the Galactic Conclave, a gray November morning by Earth's calendar, celebrated on the station with a ceremony that Voss had politely declined to have named after her, Grand Arbiter Mensol summoned her to the presiding chamber before the official proceedings began. The Grand Arbiter was old, older than the station, older than the version of the compact that now included Earth and its signatories. She sat in the center of the empty chamber with the patient stillness of something that has watched long enough to know that most things people worry about are temporary. "The invitation," said Mensol. Voss stood at the chamber floor and looked up. "What about it? When you received it, when your diplomatic corps decoded the transmission and understood what it was, did you know it was not genuine?" Voss considered this for a moment. "We suspected it wasn't a standard first contact protocol. The phrasing was inconsistent with what we'd observed of conclave communications, and the timing was convenient in a way that suggested opportunism rather than policy. You came anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Voss looked up at the vaulted ceiling again, the bioluminescent architecture, the star maps, the 400 years of wait. "Because a door is a door," she said. "It doesn't matter why it opened." Menzel regarded her with those enormous, slow eyes. "The Sarathi were right," the Grand Arbiter said finally. "When this invitation was sent, First Speaker Theris argued against it on the grounds that contact with your species was premature and potentially destabilizing. She told me. She now argues that Earth's admission is the most significant event in the Conclave's history since the founding. She told me that too. Which do you believe is accurate?" Voss thought about this with the same direct, unperformative honesty that she applied to everything. "Both," she said. "It was premature. We weren't ready, not really. I was ready, but 9 billion people aren't ready just because their best diplomat is. It was also the most significant thing to happen here in a very long time. Both things can be true." Mensol was quiet. "One more question," the Grand Arbiter said. "Of course. The postscript, in your original response to the invitation, We were waiting to see if you were worth talking to. Have you decided? Mara Voss looked around the empty chamber, the sigils on the walls, the mosaics of star systems, the seats of 300 civilizations that had, over 400 years, built something that was imperfect and slow and frequently frustrating and still, stubbornly, trying. She smiled. Yes, she said, provisionally. Mensol made a sound that the translator rendered, after a delay, as laughter, slow and deep and rich with 4 centuries of perspective. Provisionally, the Grand Arbiter repeated. That is honest. We're working on it, Voss said. Both of us. The admission ceremony was brief, by conclave standards. Earth's sigil was added to the chamber wall. A small blue-green circle, placed in the lower right quadrant where new members always went, with plenty of room above it, as the years accumulated and the record grew. Mara Voss stood at the central floor and accepted the formal welcome from Grand Arbiter Mensol and the assembled delegates of 6 civilizations, 300 chairs, and 400 years of history. She did not cry. She did not make a long speech. She said, "Thank you. We'll try not to break anything." The laughter that followed was, for the first time since her arrival, entirely genuine. All 300 delegates, 6 species, every translator variant finding the same thing in those 5 words. Not the performance of confidence, not the display of power, not the show of competence that had dominated every moment since she'd stepped off a scratched-up ship held together with rubber and audacity. Just a person, standing in an enormous room, doing her best, which was, it turned out, more than enough. Somewhere in the diplomatic archive of Conclave Station Aurum, in a file that would eventually be studied by historians of 4 species and quoted in a dozen academic papers on first contact theory, was a brief internal memo from Protocol Ambassador Velthari Us, written on the evening of the first day of the 412th summit, addressed to no one in particular, which read, "The invitation was supposed to be a joke. For future reference, the next time we consider sending a message to a species we've flagged as dangerous, volatile, and impossible to predict, perhaps consider the possibility that those words describe something that is difficult, not something that is less. There is a difference. I understand it now. I suspect I will spend some time thinking about how long it took me to learn it." Below that, in the margin, in a different hand, smaller, neater, the handwriting of someone who had been using the Protocol Ambassador's office to review files, was a single additional line. "Good start,